Hi, everyone. Welcome to the All Things Amyloid podcast, where we feature patients, caregivers, and clinicians who discuss amyloidosis, a rare and incurable disease. Amyloidosis occurs when the body builds up abnormal amounts of misfolded amyloid protein, which can lead to serious and life threatening outcomes. I'm your host, Mackenzie, an amyloidosis patient and founder of Mackenzie's Mission. Our goal for this podcast is to raise awareness and share firsthand what it's like to live with this disease, to care for those affected by it, and to treat it. We hope this leads to earlier diagnosis and start of treatment, which will improve patient lives. Over the past decade, research on amyloid protein diseases such as amyloidosis has rapidly advanced. This has strengthened our knowledge and laid a groundwork for developing treatments to ease the impact of these diseases. It has also revealed similarities previously unknown with other amyloid protein diseases such as Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. Adapted from his video, The Systemic Amyloidoses versus Parkinson's versus Alzheimer's, here Dr. Jeff Kelly, a pioneer and leader in this space, provide an update to what's known and still unknown about amyloid diseases.
I'm Jeff Kelly at Scripps, and what I'd like to do today is to give you an overview of amyloid diseases. So let's just start out by saying that there are about 50 human amyloid diseases. And while there are differences between them, I would argue that there's a lot more similarities than differences. And what you should take home as a given is that protein aggregation destroys tissues that don't easily regenerate. That's the main underpinning of human amyloid diseases. And there's a lot of segregation between the systemic amyloid diseases and the central nervous system disorders. But I hope I'll convince you by the end of this short presentation that this distinction may be more historic than useful, although you can draw your own conclusions on that. So the common amyloid diseases, of course, are Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. All cases of Alzheimer's are associated with dementia. A fraction of Parkinson's cases are associated with dementia. And then, historically, it was thought that transthyretin and light chain amyloidosis were systemic amyloid diseases in the sense that they largely affected the periphery. But now we know for sure that transthyretin amyloidosis evolves with time to be a central nervous system disease. It still seems that light chain amyloidosis mostly affects the peripheral organs. Now, the commonality amongst all human amyloid diseases is this cross beta sheet structure known as amyloid. So anytime you hear the word amyloid, you should think of protein structure. And it's a specific structure wherein one protein contributes to each ladder of an amyloid fibril, and the amyloid fibrils are very large. So a folded protein is the size of a small town, whereas an amyloid fibril spans the distance from the East Coast to the West Coast. So they're huge structures in comparison to a folded protein, and they adopt this classic structure in an electron micrograph. And now cryo-EM and X-ray structures have given us an atomic picture of what these structures look like. Now, remember I said in the first slide that these are diseases whereby aggregates destroy tissues that don't easily regenerate. So in almost all cases, what happens is that you either start from a folded protein wherein you undergo a conformational change, or you start from an intrinsically disordered protein. And the best examples of that are A beta and alpha synuclein associated with Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. The notion is that these proteins then misassemble into all kinds of structures, including amyloid fibrils, which is the main pathological determinant of all of these diseases. But importantly, we do not know that amyloid is the main driver of the pathology. These other structures could contribute. And there's actually a lot of evidence in the literature, particularly in light chain amyloidosis, that these smaller structures are perhaps the main drivers of the pathology. Moreover, there's evidence now from drug trials that if you can stop the transformation of newly synthesized proteins into these spectrum of aggregates, you can stop an amyloid disease from progressing without clearing the amyloid fibrils that are already present. So I just want to stress to you that there's a big question here with regards to what structures are the main drivers of amyloid disease, and that's not resolved yet. Okay, so I've worked for decades on the transthyretin amyloid diseases. And these diseases initially were thought to only affect peripheral nervous systems and peripheral organs. But now we know if we can protect these patients from organ disease and peripheral and autonomic nervous system disease without affecting the protein in the brain, ultimately they become central nervous system pathologies. So how do these diseases work? Well, you have a normally folded protein, in this case a tetramer. It has to dissociate and misfold, and that forms amyloid fibrils as well as all kinds of other structures. Initially, this process of aggregation destroys organ systems like the heart and the peripheral and autonomic nervous system. It generally affects the eye. And then, as I said, these initially peripheral diseases almost always progress to central nervous system pathology. This is exactly what happens in Parkinson's disease. In Parkinson's, you first get gastrointestinal dysfunction for about a decade before you actually start to see brain pathology, either manifesting as a movement disorder or as a dementia. So the drug that we developed for the transthyretin amyloid diseases do not clear amyloid fibrils. This happens slowly, but not on the time scale of the clinical response. What the drug does is it stabilizes newly synthesized protein and prevents its aggregation into the spectrum of non-native structures. And that's enough to stop the progression of the transthyretin amyloid diseases, no matter what the phenotype is, whether it's a cardiac phenotype or a neurological phenotype. And it probably prevents the onset of dementia as well, because we're fortunate in that tafamidis gets into the brain. And now there are many additional drugs that work for the transthyretin amyloid diseases that lower the concentration of transthyretin below the concentration that can aggregate. Now, we learned that the transthyretin amyloid diseases, like Parkinson's, first affect the periphery and then the brain through these experiments where liver transplantation was used before the onset of tafamidis to treat the hereditary TTR amyloid diseases that presented as a peripheral neuropathy. So the point is that these patients are heterozygous. They have a mutation on one allele, wild type TTR on the other. So you generate mixed tetramers comprised of mutant and wild type subunits. And all the tetramers having mutant subunits come apart faster, they misfold faster, and therefore they put the patient at risk for an aggregation disease. So you can fix that by replacing the mutant expressing liver by a liver that expresses only wild type protein. And this actually slows down the progression of the disease a lot. Now, it's not done anymore because these individuals have fragile vasculature, and the rate of complications from liver transplant is about 10%. And so young, apparently healthy people die. And once that happens in a small town, nobody else wants a liver transplant, despite the fact that it's helpful. But importantly, what we learned from the survivors of this is that it does slow down disease progression, but it doesn't slow down the dementia onset, which occurs about 10 years after the peripheral symptoms. And that's because transthyretin is synthesized in the brain, and the mutant protein and the wild type make these heterotetramers in the brain, and that ultimately leads to the demise of the parenchyma of the brain. And it's slower in the brain because the transthyretin concentration is about 25 times lower in the brain than it is in the periphery. And so, as I said, in the brain synthesizes transthyretin through the choroid plexus, which secretes the protein into the cerebral spinal fluid, and its aggregation in the circulatory system of the brain causes the demise of the central nervous system. Now, for light chain amyloidosis, as far as we know, the full-length light chain protein has to dissociate, and probably in most cases it gets cleaved into smaller fragments that aggregate, and that destroys various organ systems. Now, because these light chains are fragments of antibodies, each patient has a different full-length light chain sequence. And so the exact phenotype from patient to patient differs, and you really have to keep your eyes on this. I just talked to a patient this morning that had light chain amyloidosis with exclusively GI symptoms. More commonly, you have cardiac involvement or kidney involvement. And unfortunately, this disease is both a cancer and an amyloid disease. So the cancer component comes from the notion that you have clonal plasma cells that are expanded, and these clonal plasma cells, instead of secreting antibodies, which is normally the case, they secrete these light chain full-length dimers, which can misfold and aggregate, often, as I said, by virtue of proteolysis. So most of the time, these patients are treated by chemotherapy approaches or antibodies that kill the clonal plasma cells, and therefore you lower the protein concentration dramatically that can form these aggregates, and which leads to the demise of tissues that don't easily regenerate. So now, regarding the central nervous system diseases, the principle is pretty simple. In order for the brain to work, the neurons have to undergo these massive communication networks. And once aggregates start to cause neurons to drop out of the central nervous system, then of course you start to have cognitive dysfunction. And in Alzheimer's disease, the cognitive dysfunction comes from neurons dropping out owing to A beta plaques forming in the extracellular space and tau intracellular aggregates or amyloid forming within the axons of neurons. And this kind of 1-2 punch from A beta extracellular aggregation and tau intracellular aggregation causes neurons to start to die in the brain. And then with time, this causes the dementia and movement phenotypes of various degenerative diseases. So in particular, the notion was that the generation of the A beta peptide and its aggregation into amyloid plaques is the initial and important insult in Parkinson's disease. And then later, the intracellular tau amyloid is what causes memory dysfunction. Although now there's an antibody that was discovered by Lars Landfeld that blocks A beta aggregation and binds to amyloid fibrils, which in turn recruit microglial cells. And what these studies show is that even preventing A beta aggregation and removing A beta amyloid fibrils slows the progression of Alzheimer's disease, either by this sum of boxes score or this cognition score. And this antibody very effectively clears amyloid fibrils. So this is very different than the way that the light chain and transthyretin drugs work. There, the amyloid clearance is passive and very slow. Here, the antibody binds to the amyloid fibrils, recruits cells that clear the fibrils, namely microglia, and so the fibrils go away very quickly, as you can see from the patients on lecanemab versus the amyloid load of an individual receiving placebo. I think this drug is going to turn out to be much more effective than what this graph indicates, which is about a 25% slowing in cognitive decline. This is not unlike what some of the initial results were for drugs in the diseases that affect the periphery, wherein you start treating patients earlier and earlier and the drugs become more and more effective. So we shall see. It's very early days. This drug is just starting to be used in Alzheimer's patients. So I hope what I've shared with you today is that the conversion of a normally folded or intrinsically disordered protein into amyloid fibrils in most of these diseases affects both the periphery and the brain. And whether it affects the brain first and the periphery later, which happens in Alzheimer's disease, or it affects the periphery first and then the brain, which happens in transthyretin amyloidosis and Parkinson's disease, depends in part on what the concentration of the protein is and many other environmental factors. So be on the lookout for strange phenotypes in your patients, because not all of these patients present the same way. Sometimes in the transthyretin amyloid diseases, the brain phenotypes appear first. And while I don't know of any examples of brain phenotype in light chain amyloidosis, it wouldn't shock me if somebody finds one someday. Okay, I hope that it's very helpful. Thank you.
The connection between amyloid diseases is narrowing, thanks to the research of biologists such as Dr. Kelly. As a result of these advancements in knowledge, new solutions are being developed to benefit both the diagnosis and treatment of amyloidosis, giving patients more hope than ever before. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you'd like to watch Dr. Kelly's video, please visit Mackenzie's Mission Education Hub at mm713.org. Thank you for listening to the All Things Amyloid podcast. If you find our podcast informative, please follow and share it with others. If you want to learn more about the work we're doing at Mackenzie's Mission, please visit mm713.org. We'd also like to thank AstraZeneca Pharmaceuticals, Alexion Pharmaceuticals, Alnylam Pharmaceuticals, and Bridge Biopharma for their sponsorship to help raise awareness about amyloidosis. We hope you stay tuned for future episode drops. Thanks for listening.